They used to say I was the wild card, the liability, the one they couldn't quite trust, but couldn't fully disown either. At family gatherings, they'd pour wine for everyone, even Mallory's fiancé, who no one liked, but somehow forget I didn't drink. At my grandfather's memorial, they spelled my name wrong on the programme. Twice. When my father told the board I was unstable, he didn't flinch. He just said it like a fact, like weather. Something inconvenient but expected. The truth, I never lost my mind. I lost their narrative. My name is Riley Callahan. To the government, I was a soldier with 5 commendations and 2 deployments that never made it into the press. To my team, I was the one who always volunteered for the missions no one wanted. But to my family, I was the inconvenient daughter. The one who left and worse came back changed. I didn't cry at the right moments. I didn't wear pearls. I asked questions that made the room uncomfortable. So, they stopped calling, stopped inviting, until today. They needed me quiet, erased, because the version of me that kept going, kept building, didn't fit their story. So when they handed out seating cards at the will reading, and I saw nothing with my name, I didn't flinch. I just took the chair near the window, the one with the wobble in the left leg. The table was long, dark wood, polished enough to reflect the ceiling light, not enough to see your face. Beside me was a tray of bottled water and legal pads. No one had touched them. No one had offered me coffee. Mallory sat straight back 2 seats down in a blazer that probably cost more than my rent. She didn't look at me directly. Just that half turn of the chin, enough to register that I'd arrived and that I wasn't welcome. The pearl pin on her lapel gleamed every time she shifted her shoulder. Fake empathy. Real calculation. Ellen Ruiz, the lawyer, cleared her throat. Her glasses slid halfway down her nose. She adjusted the folder in front of her, marked in blue ink, Edward Callahan, Trust Amendment Addendum. The room tensed, almost politely. She read the clause that changed everything. As of the date recorded, Mr. Callahan transferred controlling interest of Callahan Holdings into a living trust of which Riley Elise Callahan is sole and irrevocable beneficiary. No gasps, no outbursts, just that deep, echoing kind of silence where you can hear people swallowing their pride. Mallory's hand twitched over her phone but didn't reach for it. My Uncle James glanced toward the hallway like he'd rather be anywhere else. And my Aunt Margaret, who always said she never took sides, looked directly at her lap. Richard didn't blink. He stared straight ahead. Then, slowly, he reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a check. Thick cardstock, crisp, heavy with intention. His voice didn't waver. This, he said, means nothing. The check was made out to me. $42 million. On the memo line, final settlement. He struck a match. The flame caught quick. It moved up the corner like it had been waiting its whole life to burn. My mother flinched barely. No one stopped him. The smell of charred paper and ink filled the room. He dropped the ash into the brass tray like he'd just finished a cigar, then turned to me. You're not part of this family anymore. I didn't respond. My spine stayed straight. My hands rested in my lap still, but not cold. I felt sweat down the back of my shirt, sticking fabric to skin, but my face held. Instead, I touched the inner lining of my coat. My fingers found the edge of the envelope Grandpa had given me at that greasy diner just off I-40. Inside a napkin, with a scribbled code, a name I didn't recognize, and one sentence underlined twice. Across the room, I could feel Ellen's eyes on me. Not pity recognition. The kind that doesn't ask questions, just waits for you to make the next move. Mallory finally looked up. Our eyes met, just briefly. Hers said, "Don't think this is over." Mine said, "It never began the way you think it did." Ellen adjusted her glasses. "The trust remains legally binding," she said, regardless of symbolic gestures. I stood. The chair creaked beneath me, almost like it sighed. "That's enough," I said, not to anyone in particular. As I walked past the table, past the old oil portraits of men who died with titles and sons who never earned them, I didn't look back. Outside, the January air hit like truth-cold, clear, impossible to argue with. I exhaled. They could burn the check. They couldn't burn the truth. And they couldn't burn me. But before I share my story with you, I'd love to know you're here with me. Drop a simple hi in the comments so I know you're listening, or let me know where you're watching from. I love to see how far my story can reach. And if this story finds a place in your heart, please consider subscribing. It helps stories like mine get heard, stories of strength buried in silence. Thank you. 2 years earlier, I had stepped off a red-eye flight from Germany in the same coat I wore today. My boots still carried gravel from Ramstein. My bag was taped at the seams, one strap about to give. No one was waiting at arrivals. I watched other families wave signs, hug tightly, cry, laugh, drive away. My name wasn't on a placard. My sister didn't text. My father didn't even ask which day I'd land. The rideshare driver yawned through most of the trip back to the suburbs. It was past midnight when I stepped onto the porch of the house I grew up in. The light was off. The doorbell didn't work. I knocked 3 times before Mallory opened it barefoot. No makeup, holding a glass of Pinot like she hadn't gone to sleep, just drifted sideways. "Oh," she said, "I thought you were coming next week." That was the welcome. My room upstairs had become a storage space. Holiday decorations in cracked tubs. A treadmill still in its box. 3 boxes labelled Mallory. Wedding stacked on the bed. My bookshelf was gone, replaced by framed stock photos of vineyards. No one had asked, no one had called. It was like they'd bet I wouldn't come back. I slept on the couch for 3 nights until I found a studio rental above a dry cleaner 15 miles away. No windows, but it was mine. That week, I tried logging into our family's asset portal, the system Grandpa had set up to manage trust properties dividends. My name didn't appear anywhere. My access code returned unauthorized. When I asked my father, he shrugged and said, "I thought you weren't interested in any of that anymore." I didn't argue. I just stared at the screen a little longer than I should have. The thing about disappearing is no one really notices it happening. They just keep adjusting the frame until you no longer fit. At night, I'd cook frozen dumplings in a scratched pan and sit alone at the foldable table under a buzzing ceiling fan. There was something comforting in the quiet. Not peaceful, just consistent. No expectations. No pretending. I still got up every morning at 5, ran 3 miles, took freelance intelligence briefs, tracked migration data from Eastern Europe for a private contractor. They paid me in prepaid cards. I wore a headset. No one ever saw my face. I wasn't unemployed. I wasn't lost. I just stopped showing up where they didn't want me. One Sunday, a few weeks into my return, Mallory stopped by the apartment unannounced. She didn't even look up when I opened the door, just walked in like she owned it and sat down at the tiny table. "Mum thinks you're having a breakdown," she said, looking at her nails. I said nothing. Poured tea into a chipped mug and slid it across the table. She told people you're clerking at a logistics firm. Said it sounds respectable enough. Still, I didn't speak. I just folded the napkin on my lap into a square, then into a tighter square. The habit never left me. "You know," she added, "we all thought you'd re-up. Stay overseas. Quiet, exit, clean break. You didn't really fit here anymore." Her voice wasn't cruel. It was bored, like she was reciting something she'd already decided was history. I smiled faintly. That was my response. She looked at the ceiling, exhaled, stood. "Anyway, I have to pick up Theo from soccer. Don't disappear too far, okay?" She meant it as a joke, but the words landed heavy. After she left, I looked at the tea she didn't drink, still steaming slightly. The folded napkin sat on her side of the table, untouched. I moved it to the trash. That was the day I stopped expecting anyone to ask how I was doing. Truth is, people like me don't come home. We just reappear in places they forgot to lock. I wasn't angry. I wasn't even surprised. I was just done. Done asking for a seat. Done explaining my silence. Done being measured against people who'd never seen what I'd seen. They didn't kill me, but they did everything short of trying. And somehow I was still here. A few months before my grandfather died, he called me out of nowhere. No pleasantries, no small talk, just a time and a place, 8:30 a.m, Murphy's Diner off Route 17. I thought maybe he wanted to say goodbye or apologise. I was wrong on both counts. He was already there when I arrived, seated at a corner booth, black coffee untouched in front of him. No cane, no oxygen tank. Just him and that signature stillness he carried like armour. His suit was too formal for the venue, but no one questioned it. People like him never needed to justify their presence. I slid into the booth across from him. He didn't smile, just looked at me like he was calculating something behind his eyes. "You eat?" he asked. "Not yet?" He nodded once like he'd expected that. We didn't order. Instead, he reached into his inner coat pocket and pulled out a napkin. Standard diner paper folded twice over. He set it down between us, then pushed it toward me with 2 fingers, as if handing off something far heavier than it looked. I picked it up. On the inside, written in his tidy but aging script, was a string of characters, uppercase letters, numbers, symbols, clearly a password. Below that, in bolder ink, one sentence: "If they try to erase, you don't fight. Just prove you were always there." I read it twice. My stomach tightened. I looked up, but he was already watching me like he knew exactly where my thoughts would go. "Why are you giving me this?" I asked. He didn't answer. Just reached for the small metal sugar caddy and placed a single packet next to his mug. Not in the coffee, just beside it, neat and square. "You're not owed explanations, Riley," he said finally, "but you deserve the truth." I waited. He didn't elaborate. "You think they'll come after me?" I asked. His eyes held mine. "They already have. They just haven't finished yet." The waitress walked by and refilled our cups. Neither of us drank. The steam curled up, caught the light, disappeared. "What's in the account?" I asked, nodding toward the napkin. "Not money," he said. "Proof, legacy, documentation, things they'll pretend never existed. But you..." He stopped, then leaned back. "You keep this safe. Don't open it yet. Wait until the noise starts." That part confused me then. What noise? But I nodded anyway. He watched me tuck the napkin into my coat pocket, like a man placing a bet. "I didn't leave you much in the paperwork," he added. "On purpose?" I raised an eyebrow. He gave a half smile. "If it's not in the paperwork, they can't contest it. But what's in that folder? That's the real will." Silence fell again, the kind only blood family can hold without discomfort. When I stood to leave, he didn't hug me, didn't say goodbye. He just tapped the table with one knuckle. "Riley," he said quietly, "they'll underestimate you. Let them. It's the last gift they'll ever give." I carried that napkin home in the pocket of a jacket I only wore on Sundays. For weeks, I didn't look at it again. I didn't need to. The message was already stitched into my skin. When he died, I wasn't listed in the obituary. Not directly. Just survived by 2 loving children and 1 devoted granddaughter. That granddaughter was Mallory. No one called me when the funeral was scheduled. I showed up anyway, stood in the back, wore the only black suit I owned, and didn't cry. I watched Mallory deliver a eulogy filled with words like stability and tradition, words I never heard him use, not once. Later, I sat in the parking lot with the napkin in my hand, unfolded it again, reread the sentence. "Don't fight, just prove you were always there." I didn't know it then, but those 13 words would become my entire compass. The Monday after the will reading, I went to the bank. It was cold enough to see your breath, but the lobby heater was broken, so the receptionist wore fingerless gloves and a forced smile. I handed over my ID and account number. She typed, something paused, frowned, then asked me to wait. 10 minutes passed, then 15. A man in a charcoal suit came out from the back office. He looked like someone who kept golf clubs in his trunk just in case. His name tag read Senior Client Liaison, which usually means person who tells you what you're not allowed to ask. "Miss Callahan," he said, not offering a seat. "I'm afraid there's a hold on your accounts." I blinked. "Excuse me, a legal hold, initiated late last week, per a directive issued under the Callahan Family Trust. There's a pending internal review tied to a civil motion. It appears your authority is being contested." "I'm listed on the trust," I said calmly. "The amendment was read aloud 3 days ago." He offered a tight smile. "Yes, well, there are competing interpretations in play. By who, I'm not at liberty to say." Of course he wasn't. I asked for a printout. He declined. I asked to speak with legal. He gave me a card with a phone number and no name. "Until it's resolved," he added, "we recommend you refrain from attempting withdrawals or asset transfers. Any such action could be construed as a violation of fiduciary protocols." He said that like I was a threat, like I was about to run off with their legacy stuffed in my backpack. I left without saying another word. The next day, I drove to the DMV. My driver's license was due to expire in 3 weeks, and I figured now was as good a time as any to get ahead of something for once. The woman at the counter took my paperwork, scanned it, then looked at her screen for a long time too long for a simple renewal. "Is something wrong?" I asked. She didn't look at me when she answered. "Your file has a block on it." "What kind of block?" "There's a notation tied to a court order from Cedar Ridge County. June of last year. Temporary capacity restriction." "Capacity," I repeated. "Cognitive," she clarified. "Marked as unresolved." My throat went dry. "That's impossible. I've never had a hearing. I was overseas in June." She frowned. "I'm just telling you what's in the system. Can I get a copy?" "No, ma'am. You'll need to petition the court directly." When I walked back to my car, I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I sat in the driver's seat with my hands on the wheel and stared at the empty passenger seat for 5 full minutes. The coffee in the cup holder had gone cold. I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out the folded note Grandpa had written. The ink was starting to fade along the crease lines, but the words were still there, stubborn and clear. "If they try to erase, you don't fight. Just prove you were always there." This wasn't a mistake. It was a playbook. A coordinated erasure designed to strip me out of my own legal footprint, piece by piece, quietly, officially. I started to retrace it in my head. The delay at the bank, the casual tone from Richard at the will reading, the way Mallory never looked surprised. The timing lined up too well to be coincidence. Back home, I opened my laptop. My login to the internal family archive, dead. The proxy server I used for freelance intel briefs, blocked. My credit report showed a sudden dip in score marked identity verification pending. My medical records were no longer linked to the federal system. It wasn't just my money they were freezing. It was my name. They wanted to make it so that when I spoke up, it would be easy to dismiss. "Oh, she's not well. She's unstable. We had to take action for her own good." It sounded clean, compassionate even. That was the trick they didn't need to destroy me, just disqualify me. The next morning, I called the courthouse in Cedar Ridge. The clerk transferred me twice before someone found the docket number. Yes, there was a petition filed. Yes, it was signed by a licensed medical evaluator. Yes, there was a ruling temporary incapacity due to PTSD and cognitive decline. Signed. Sealed. never served. Filed by a guardian ad litem named Daniel Grayson. I didn't know the name. I never met the man. But somehow he'd signed off on my mental state without ever seeing my face. The clerk offered to email me the public copy. I gave her a burner address. 20 minutes later, it arrived. I stared at the PDF until the lines blurred. At the bottom of the form under client's signature was a scrawl that looked almost like mine. Almost, except I sign with my left hand. And this was right-handed work. I closed the laptop, stood up, looked out the window. The city was waking up. Traffic thickened. Lights blinked in offices where people were probably worried about lunch orders or parking tickets. Meanwhile, I was being deleted, but not quietly. I slipped the napkin back into its envelope, slid it into my bag, picked up my keys. I didn't know exactly what came next, but I knew where to start. The name listed on the psychological evaluation, Dr. Everett Lang, was based in a suburban office park just outside Cedar Ridge. His credentials were legitimate. Website clean 5-star reviews, clinic photos with bookshelves and succulents, and those stock images of happy couples no one believes. I scheduled an appointment under a pseudonym just in case. When I walked in, the receptionist offered me a clipboard. I handed her a blank form and told her I was here to discuss a previous evaluation. She hesitated, then waved me back. Lang's office smelled like mint and carpet glue. He wore a tan sweater and rimless glasses, looked like someone who gave gentle advice over chamomile. "Ms. Callahan?" he asked, eyes scanning the printout in his hand. I sat down without answering. He glanced at the folder, then back at me. "I apologise. I don't have a record of seeing you as a patient." I tilted my head. June 14th, 2023, Cognitive Capacity Assessment, signed under oath. He blinked. I was sent a file, but I assumed you assumed wrong. I pulled out a copy of the evaluation from my bag and laid it on his desk. "You signed this?" He looked pale now. His fingers trembled slightly as he turned the pages. "This? Yes, that's my signature, but I don't remember this case. It must have been part of a third-party review. Sometimes we get requests to sign off on people you've never met." I kept my voice level, not angry, just focused. He looked down. "It happens more than it should." I let the silence stretch long enough for him to hear it. "You understand this report was used to declare me mentally unfit?" I asked. "To remove my access to family assets, financial tools, even my ID?" He nodded slowly. "I didn't know the outcome, I swear." But you signed?" "Yes. Based on the summary they sent." "Who's they?" "A firm called Cedar Strategic Solutions. Legal referral service. I assumed they had direct evaluation notes." I slid my phone out, turned on voice memos, and placed it on the table between us. "Can you repeat that last part?" He hesitated, then nodded. "I signed a document based on secondary information. I did not evaluate Ms. Callahan in person. I have never met her before today." I hit stop, saved the file. "You'll be contacted by my attorney," I said. "You're lucky I'm not pressing criminal charges yet." He tried to explain again something about administrative pressure, streamlined review systems, bulk casework. I stopped listening. This wasn't a mistake. It was a mechanism. A methodical effort to vanish me through paperwork and loopholes. And it almost worked. I walked out without shaking his hand. Outside, the sun had warmed just enough to feel fake. The kind of heat that doesn't reach your bones. I stood by my car and stared at the printed report again. His signature sat in the lower right corner. Clean. Confident. A man who'd never spoken to me, deciding I no longer had the right to speak for myself. That was the game. Not just to discredit me, but to do it in a way that seemed reasonable, even professional. I drove back toward Arlington in silence. No music, just the low hum of tires and the sound of one truth crawling its way to the surface. If they were willing to fake a diagnosis, they were willing to go further. This wasn't about inheritance. It was about disappearance. Permanent and quiet. I checked my rearview mirror 3 times on the drive home. Not because I was being followed, but because I needed to know I still existed, that I still left a shadow on the road. When I got back to my apartment, I pulled out the envelope again. The napkin was there, folded tight, but it wasn't enough anymore. I needed allies, real ones, people who didn't need convincing that I was still here, people who believed in paper trails. I knew who to call next. Her name was Hannah Kim. We'd met briefly 5 years ago during a workshop on forensic authentication and legal archiving. I remembered her not for her PowerPoint slides, but for the way she circled a forged contract and said, "Perfection is a red flag. No human signs cleanly under pressure." Her office was on the 2nd floor of a narrow strip mall in Falls Church above a Korean bakery that smelled like red bean buns and roasted sesame. No receptionist, no waiting room, just a dark wooden door with a small plaque H, Kim, documentation disputes and integrity law. She opened it herself, sharp eyes, hair in a loose knot coffee in one hand. I charged by the hour, she said, stepping aside to let me in. "Don't waste it." I handed her a manila folder with everything: the forged psych, eval, the court order, from Cedar Ridge my revoked access slips, and 2 versions of my birth certificate. One from the family archive, one physical copy I'd kept tucked inside an old photo album. She read fast, like someone trained to look for lies between margins. "You sign with your left hand?" she asked. "Yes." "Then this," she said, pointing at the digital scan, was made by a right-handed template. Stroke consistencies too smooth. No hesitation. And look here, no pressure variance at all. "So, it's fake," I said. "Digitally rendered, software assisted, probably made with Adobe Sign and a pen tablet. High-end forgery. But still a forgery." She compared signatures, held one page up to the light. "See this? No ink bleed? No vibration lines? It's image perfect. That means it was lifted, cleaned, and relayered. Cleaned from what I asked. Probably another document you did sign. That's the irony. They used your own writing to cut you out of yourself." The words hit harder than I expected. I didn't show it. Instead, I pulled the envelope from my coat. There's more. I unfolded the napkin, laid it flat on her desk. Her eyes scanned the string of characters, the handwritten message underneath. "If they try to erase you, don't fight. Just prove you were always there. That your grandfather's handwriting," she asked. I nodded. "He gave this to me 3 months before he died." No explanation. She was already typing, hands flying across the keyboard. "Encrypted storage," she murmured. "Format looks old school. He probably used a personal secure cloud node, not institutional." She ran the code through a local directory search, then paused. "There's a hit. One folder. Legacy. Subfolder. RC42. RC for Riley Callahan. 42 for the trust fund. Or your birth year. Or both. Doesn't matter. What matters is this wasn't deleted, just buried." She opened the folder. Inside were 4 subcategories. Documents, audio, video, originals. She clicked on documents first. Scanned copies of the original trust amendment. Stamped, notarized, dated. With Edward Callahan's actual signature ink, dragged slightly on the tail of the Y in Legacy Holdings. No one forges that kind of imperfection. "This is real," she whispered. "It predates the contested version by 7 months. Then, how did they buried it, overwrote it in the family registry, replaced everything public-facing with the sanitized version." "Can you prove that?" I asked. "We just did." She clicked next audio. A file labelled Library 03 Edward Final, Baptême MP4A. She played it. My grandfather's voice filled the room, slower than I remembered. "But sure. If you're hearing this," he said, "then the wrong people got involved too soon. Riley, I'm sorry. I knew what they were capable of, but I didn't think they'd move this fast. You'll find what you need here. The truth's not always loud. Sometimes it's a whisper you keep in your pocket until the shouting stops. My chest tightened, not from grief, but recognition. He knew. He saw this coming. He made this the week before he went into the hospital, I said. Hannah didn't answer. She was already saving everything to a drive running hash verifications for chain of custody. You understand what we're holding, she said. This isn't just a rebuttal. It's a full restoration case. If you want to go public, I don't. I cut in. Then, what do you want? I looked at the screen. At my name finally attached to something that couldn't be overwritten, to make it undeniable, I said, I don't need revenge. I just need the record corrected. She nodded slowly. Then we do it properly. No media, no courtroom drama yet, just paper. Paper that bleeds if you look close enough. Hannah clicked open the last 2 folders, video and originals. She paused for a moment, then looked at me. You ready for this? I gave the smallest nod. She hit play on the first video. The screen showed my grandfather seated at his desk, the old one, with the lion claw feet and green glass banker's lamp. His tie was slightly loose, his hair combed, but tired. He looked directly into the camera. No preamble, no pretense. If you're watching this, he began, it means someone tried to bury the truth. Or worse, burn it. He leaned forward, hands clasped. I don't know if it was Richard, or Mallory, or all of them. But if they touched that check, if they lit it, they didn't just set fire to paper. They made a statement. That they think this name belongs to them more than it does to you. He took a breath. Not weak measured. They're wrong. He reached beside him, pulled out a folder, thicker than I expected. Everything's here. Originals, notarized, witnessed, filed under trust law. They'll try to say it's invalid. They'll say I was confused. But I wasn't. I made the transfer clear. Riley Callahan owns controlling interest. Full stop. His eyes darkened. They'll make noise. That's what people do when they lose power. But don't let their noise shake your ground. The paper is stronger than they think. He hesitated, then softened. You've carried a lot alone. I know that. More than anyone gave you credit for. You don't need their validation. You never did. But if you want proof, I left it. Not just for court. For you. The screen flickered and went dark. Hannah sat very still. We timestamp this, she said. We notarize chain of custody. And we prep the audio next. She opened the next 5. This time it wasn't scripted. No camera. Just a mic catching low, voices, background noise, the creak of a leather chair, the rustle of papers. Richard's voice was unmistakable. Clipped, defensive. She's not ready. You're giving too much to someone who's unstable. You said it yourself. She vanished for years. My grandfather's voice came through sharper now. She served. She built systems. While you were trading golf tips with board members, she was building strategic models that saved lives. That's not the same as running a company. No, he said it's harder. It demands clarity, humility. You wouldn't last a week in her field. Richard laughed hollow. You're being sentimental. It's dangerous. Dangerous, my grandfather snapped. That girl has more Callahan blood than the rest of us combined. You want loyalty. She didn't need anything from me and still came back. That's loyalty. The recording ended there. I realized I was gripping the edge of the desk. Hannah exhaled quietly, then reached into a drawer and pulled out a slim hard drive. We're going to mirror the full archive. Air-gapped. Nothing online. You think they're watching? I asked. I think they're desperate, she said. And desperate people don't like evidence. We backed up the drive, encrypted it, then stored it in a small fireproof case she labelled by hand, RC42. Custody, copy 1. We build outward from this, she said. Timeline. Document integrity, witness affidavits, No drama, just process. And when we're ready, we send them a letter. Calm, quiet, and devastating. She leaned back in her chair. But first she added, "You need to decide something." "What's that?" "Do you want to win this quietly, or make sure they never erase another person like you again?" I didn't answer right away. My eyes were still on the screen on the folder, with my name that had sat in the dark, untouched, waiting. I thought of the chair with no name, the look Mallory gave me, the silence from my father when he lit that check. And I realised this wasn't just about legacy. This was about showing them I was never the girl who needed rescuing. I was the one who'd already survived their fire. Hannah and I agreed to move forward methodically. The next morning, she drafted a letter to the bank, the Cedar Ridge County Clerk, and the trustee of the Callahan Trust. Each document requesting an immediate freeze on all contested assets and accounts until full forensic review and legal determination. We created strict timelines, 14-day response windows, notifications to relevant financial institutions, and a sealed filing in the Cedar Ridge Superior Court. We did not include anything in the release, no leaks, no dramatic headlines. Instead, I quietly reviewed the drafts, heart-pounding, knowing this paperwork was our first real stand. That evening, I sat alone at my apartment table scattered with coffee cups, printouts, and the fireproof flash drive labelled RC42 Custody Copy 1. I typed a single message to Trent Adler, a journalist I'd met during my first private contractor briefings, one known for his careful handling of intel origin stories. I hesitated for a moment, then pressed send. They erased me from their story. Doesn't mean I was never in it. The message went out at 7:02 p.m. I didn't expect a reply, but a few minutes later, my phone vibrated. Trent's response was simple. On it. The next morning, I cleared my inbox and found an email from Trent with a headline draft: "She was declared unfit to inherit, but her legacy says otherwise." The draft included bullet points: psych evaluation signed without in-person assessment. Source confirms trust amendment buried in private cloud. Fordham County Court documents reveal no service. I realised then how cold these fact lists felt, but this was exactly what we needed: evidence standing still, unafraid. Trent's article went live midday. I sat at my desk and stared. Embedded were scans of the forged psych evaluation, grainy photos of that old lion claw desk and his caption under the trust amendment image. Original, notarized copy circulated among family lawyers in March, but omitted from public filings. No interviews. Just muted disclosures. No dramatic press release. No staged footage of me in front of a courthouse. That would come later if we needed it. For now, it was about the record. Almost immediately, responses came. Former colleagues from contractor firms left messages. Glad to see someone looking into this. Another anonymous saw your training logs. No one finds anyone on purpose. They leave clues. But I said nothing. I just folded my napkin code into my phone pocket like an amulet. Trent's story spread across forums, Reddit threads in legal pages, corporate inheritance blogs, veterans networks. Headlines in niche financial communities scooped the broader news channels by evening. A comment under the article read, "This feels like the plot of a corporate thriller, except real, and she's living it." I didn't respond. I didn't even open the comment thread. Instead, I kept working. Later that night, Trent sent a message. They froze your accounts, reversed the psych hold, and trustee confirmed freeze on trust distribution. They're trying to keep it quiet for now. My heart stopped, not from relief, but because I realised now we had momentum. The paperwork was working. The quiet stand was enough to shift the machinery. I replied simply, "Good." The next morning, Hannah and I drove to Falls Church. I carried 2 thick folders, one with full litigation, ready documentation, the other with spec packages for future media releases if necessary. She filed the motions in Cedar Ridge. Paperwork was served, affidavits sworn. I felt the weight of each signature, mine, hers, the trustees. Each stroke on each line mattered. On our way out, Hannah paused. "You did this quietly," she said. "You didn't send reporters crying for attention. You didn't do photo ops. That's your power." I nodded. "This isn't about spectacle, it's about permanence." Back at my apartment, I pieced together my next steps, finalising witnesses like Dr. Lang, the forger John Matthews, the notary who oversaw the trust amendment meeting, and Trent as media witness and preparing for the hearing set in 2 weeks. I placed all their signed affidavits into a binder labelled RC42, Restoration Evidence. On the morning of the hearing, I walked past my building's mirror. My face looked calm on the outside, no emotion. But inside, I felt heavy. This meeting could define everything. Or at least it would decide if I remained erased or not. The courthouse in Cedar Ridge was older than I expected. Brick walls, worn wooden banisters, and the kind of silence that made your footsteps sound accusatory. I arrived 30 minutes early. Hannah was already there, organising our files, with the same calm she always wore like armour. "No outbursts," she said quietly as I sat beside her. "No emotion, no reaction. Let the paper speak." I nodded. My palms were cold. The courtroom was half full. Reporters, distant family members, and the Callahan legal entourage who had the air of people who had never been told no. Judge Rena Kinley entered with no fanfare. Mid-50s, no nonsense, known in legal circles as the scalpel. She cut through pretense and performance like it offended her. "We are here today to hear evidence regarding the contested trust amendment of Edward Callahan," she began, "and to review the competency declaration placed upon Ms. Riley Callahan." My name in that room still felt foreign, like a ghost being called back from a grave no one visited. The opposing side opened. Richard's attorney was a thin man with a smooth voice, and the practiced charm of someone used to reshaping facts with tone alone. He argued that the trust amendment was inconclusive, suggested Edward had been manipulated late in life, and implied without stating outright that I had a history of mental instability. My fists clenched, but I didn't speak. That wasn't my role today. Hannah stood. "We submit to the court forensic records verifying the amendment's signature metadata, proving creation date, and a notarized affidavit from the attending legal witness. We also submit documentation reversing the medical diagnosis of cognitive impairment, signed by the original doctor, who confirms he never saw the subject in person." She walked the judge through each piece with surgical precision. Then she turned to the flash drive. "And finally, Your Honour, we present a direct statement from Edward Callahan, filmed in the weeks prior to his passing, stored securely and authenticated by digital timestamp." The courtroom went still. Judge Kinley gave a small nod. The lights dimmed. The projector flickered. There he was, Grandpa seated at his desk tie, loose that old lion claw chair creaking softly beneath him. "If you're watching this," he said, "then someone tried to bury the truth. Probably Richard." His voice was steady, even tired. "Let them have their tantrum. Burn whatever paper they want. But remember, they can't burn you." In the back row, I saw Mallory shift. Her arms crossed tighter. Richard leaned forward, staring at the floor. Grandpa continued. "Riley earned what I gave her. Not with charm or lunches at the club. With grit, with silence when it mattered, and with clarity when the rest of us were running scared." His voice cracked not from weakness, but from conviction. "Don't fight them head on. Just prove you were always there." The screen dimmed. The room stayed quiet long after the video ended. Judge Kinley broke the silence. "Counselor," she asked the opposition. The lawyer stood, stammered something about late-stage confusion, stress-induced statements, but his arguments had lost their teeth. Judge Kinley asked me to stand. "Ms. Callahan," she said, "do you wish to make a statement?" I met her eyes. Only this, I didn't come back to fight for money. I came back because someone tried to erase me, and I don't believe silence should equal consent. She studied me for a long moment. Then she nodded, made a note on her pad, and said, "We'll reconvene in 20 minutes. Outside the courtroom, I stood in the cold hallway facing the window. Below, press photographers waited behind barriers. Hannah came up beside me. "You did well," she said. "They saw the truth." "Did they?" I asked. "Or just the paperwork, both," she replied. Sometimes paper is the only language power understands. We went back in. Judge Kinley returned. Her voice was firm. "This court finds the trust amendment valid. The incapacitation declaration is vacated retroactively. The financial and legal status of Ms. Callahan is to be fully restored, effective immediately." My breath caught. Not joy, not even relief, just stillness, like my name had finally stopped being a rumour. The judge continued. "Furthermore, the court recommends a formal investigation into potential document fraud and perjury committed by parties involved in the original incapacitation filing." Richard didn't move. Mallory looked away. The gavel struck, session ended. Reporters tried to rush forward. Hannah stepped in front of me. "No comment," she said. "Please respect the process." We left through the side exit. No cameras, no press statement, just me, Hannah, and the winter air outside that smelled like smoke even though nothing was burning. The courthouse doors clicked shut behind us, with a finality that didn't echo. The verdict had been clear, almost surgical. My legal identity reinstated. Full control of the trust recognised. And the most unexpected line, the case of forged documents and falsified medical assessments, would be referred to the district attorney for criminal investigation. They'd buried me under signatures and silence. But now, the paper trail was mine. Still, there were no cheers, no applause. Just a grey sky that couldn't make up its mind between rain and fog and the slickness of wet concrete underfoot. I didn't open an umbrella. I didn't even speed up. The water on my face felt realer than anything I'd experienced in that courtroom. We walked toward the curb. Hannah tucked a leather folder under her arm, still shielding it even in the rain. She had the quiet posture of someone who had just won a battle, but already saw the next one coming over the ridge. "You want to push this further?" she asked, glancing sideways at me. "Criminal court, testimonies, depositions, names in headlines. You'd win." I shook my head. "I don't want revenge," I said. "I just don't want to be erased again." She didn't argue. That was the thing about Hannah. She understood the difference between justice and restoration. We reached her car. She drove me back through downtown past rows of brick buildings and bus stops slick with rain. I stared out the window. Something in me had settled but not softened. The fight was over, but the wound would never fully close. Not because I needed more, but because what I'd lost wasn't just access. It was the years I'd spent thinking my silence was my weakness. Turns out it was my strength. That courtroom never saw me cry. They never saw me raise my voice. But they did see the evidence. They saw the woman who refused to disappear. When we pulled up to my apartment, Hannah didn't get out. She handed me a sealed envelope. "Finalized copies. Keep them dry," she said. I nodded and stepped out into the rain. The building smelled like damp carpet and old pine cleaner, comforting in a strange way. Familiar. I climbed the stairs slowly, the envelope tight in my hand. Inside my apartment, I placed it on the kitchen counter. I didn't open it. Not yet. I poured a glass of water, sat down at the table. The silence was different now. It didn't press on me. It held me. I pulled out my phone and scrolled through messages I hadn't opened for weeks. One from Trent, "You good another," from a former analyst I hadn't seen in years. Heard the ruling. Quiet wins are the loudest. and one from a name I hadn't expected. Jules, an old colleague from my Langley days. Saw your story. I remember the day you ran that op in Kabul. We called you the ghost because no one saw you coming, but you always left things changed. I stared at that one for a long time. Then I replied, still here. Outside, a siren passed. Then quiet again. I stood up, picked up the envelope and carried it to the small wooden box on my shelf. The one labelled unclaimed. I opened it. Inside were pieces of me people had tried to write out of the story. My military badge, a bent nameplate from my old desk, a snapshot of my mother smiling beside an empty chair mine. I added the court documents to the box. Not because I needed to revisit them, but because they belonged with the rest. Evidence that I had been here all along. Before I turned off the light, I stood at the window. Rain traced the glass. My reflection stared back. Not triumphant, not broken, just whole. I didn't need to win again. I just needed to exist. And now I did. That quiet moment was all the inspiration I needed. I didn't open a foundation or hold a press conference. Instead, I built Second Shift, a discreet digital platform where women veterans could connect with mentors, legal advisors, and financial counsellors. Each connection verified, each discussion confidential. I wasn't the poster face. I didn't do ribbon cuttings or press statements. I was the hand guiding messages, the mind organising webinars, the ears reading texts in the middle of the night. My apartment desk became mission control, 2 monitors, encrypted server access, a constant stream of notifications. One evening, I stayed late. My tea had gone cold. Lines of code and secure logins blurred on the screen. I paused to rub my temples when a message pinged on the platform. I saw the article. Because of you, I didn't delete my profile. It was from a veteran named Maya responding to Trent's story. My heart stuttered. That one sentence felt heavier than any court document. I replied simply, "Thank you for being here." Then I closed the chat. That message replayed behind my eyes the rest of the night, a reminder that restoration wasn't just about paper and courtrooms. It was about lives preserved. Over the next weeks, Second Shift grew quietly. A retired judge offered pro bono guidance to veterans dealing with legal identity issues. A tax advisor volunteered to host a session on financial recovery. A small group met for virtual coffee hours, the chat filled with names like Hope, Gabrielle, Linda. One message came in late at night. Your platform saved me when I thought I had no rights left. I didn't respond with fanfare. I logged the interaction, ensured privacy settings were intact, and moved on to the next message. I thought about what Grandpa said. Don't try to convince them. Just prove you were always there. This platform wasn't my billboard. It was proof. Quiet, persistent, useful. Each veteran who logged in each question, answered each resource shared. It was another line in a ledger, another way to show presence. Mallory reached out once. Just a text saw the ruling. Proud of you. I stared at it. I didn't reply for hours. When I did, I wrote, thanks. Enough. Summer arrived. Office hours moved earlier. I would wake at 6, respond to overnight messages, schedule sessions, then lace up running shoes and head out. The early light felt different now, softer, not because the days were longer, but because I wasn't running away from anything. One Sunday morning, I sat beside the window and reopened Maya's message. I typed carefully, I was once erased. Welcome back. And as I sent it, I realised I'd written the exact echo of Grandpa's words, but aimed at strangers, allies I'd never met in person. On a Tuesday, the district attorney's office requested my availability. They needed testimony for the forgery case. Hannah called it a big step, but I hesitated. Second Shift had begun to feel like home. Courtrooms and cameras, those belonged to a different life. But I also knew that staying silent now would mean trusting people like me never to be erased again. I scheduled it. Quietly, confidentially. Through fall, I managed platform updates between court preparations. I walked the city with my earbuds on, half listening to a webinar about business grants, half listening to my own heartbeat. I taught myself to breathe through systems, legal, emotional, digital. Then, one night, a new message popped up. I saw the article. I'm trying again. Under it, a name I hadn't seen before, Tessa. I typed back, "Second shift is your space." Then stared at the screen a long time, thinking about how each message was a ripple from that first quiet stand. By winter, membership surpassed 50 women. Not big in corporate terms, but enough for me. Enough for the bench of voices and needs, legal, career, emotional. One veteran messaged to thank me. "You gave me proof I exist beyond their forgetting." My breath caught. I typed, "You've always existed. I never expected to lead a movement. I just started with a notebook." But here I was typing lines into a system, stringing together mentors, witnesses, documents, and within that web healing. I never opened a business license. No office, no branding. I chose to be unseen, but not inaudible. Second shift grew in private, but every message carried a light. I finalize each day, reviewing encryption logs, ensuring no one's data leaked or was lost. Then, I close the lid lamp off heart full. Outside, the city pulses quietly. I pass through subway stations, buses, shops. No one stops me. No one cheers. But I walk straighter now. My reflection looks peaceful. My name lights up response screens, chat logs, legal docs. I'm here. At midnight, one final ping. You gave me back my voice. And for the first time in a long time, my eyes leaked something close to a smile. A few weeks later, I signed a short-term lease on a narrow storefront in Arlington, just over 50 square feet, with scuffed floors and tall windows. No ribbon cutting, no public announcement. I painted a simple wooden sign, R. Callahan, consultant and advocate, and I hung it quietly one misty morning. It swung softly in the breeze, visible enough that neighbours noticed, but not shouting. I moved in over the course of a weekend. A small wooden desk, 2 chairs, a filing cabinet, and a box lamp on a pedestal. No logo, no banner, no corporate stack behind glass. Just a clean space with a deep blue rug and a metal shelf holding the essentials, copies of second shift guidelines, a binder marked legal aid resources, and a single framed photo me in uniform, standing tall beside my grandfather at his 70th birthday. I didn't hang a portrait of me in a suit or press releases on the wall. This was more than an office, it was a marker of presence. A statement that I existed here, I was available, and my work wasn't going anywhere. One afternoon, I was seated at the desk reviewing applications for volunteer mentors when the bell above the door jingled. A woman paused, reading the sign. Tall, late 40s, kind eyes shadowed by exhaustion, familiar to me in a way I couldn't explain until she spoke. "Excuse me, R. Callahan. Adverse, that's advocate. What do you do here?" I looked up and offered a measured smile. I closed the binder in front of me and stood. The lights inside felt warm against the grey day outside. "I save seats," I said quietly. "For people who've been pushed aside." She tilted her head, uncertain. "Seats. Second shift connects female veterans with mentors and resources," I explained. "This office is where I meet anyone who needs a place to be seen." I gestured to the chairs. There were 2 set apart ready. "Everyone's welcome." She let the words settle and then nodded. She didn't say more than, "Thank you," but it was enough. I felt the air change just slightly as she walked away. I didn't stop her. That door remained open. Later that evening, I took something from my old filing box at home, the burnt check frame. I'd retrieved it months ago after the courtroom. The charred edges and grey ash contrasted with the pristine certificate of trust hanging beside it. With steady hands, I placed the check inside a clear sleeve and added it to a small archive box. On a shelf labelled in neat handwriting, "What they tried to take." Under it, I tucked the court documents transcripts and printed napkin code. All the tangible proof of my erasure and my return. I set the box beside the mental binder on the shelf. It wasn't a trophy, it was insurance, a reminder, a signal. One evening, I sat alone after hours, the office empty desk lamp casting a circle of light. I closed the door and stepped behind it. The sign looked different now, not like a nameplate, but a banner over a promise. A promise I was keeping for me, and for all those who needed someone to anchor their presence. I texted a list of volunteer lawyers. Our next legal advice session starts in 2 weeks. I scheduled the first open hour with a financial advisor volunteer. Then I drafted a gentle reminder email to our small veteran community. Seats are open. You're invited. Before I left, I took the framed check and looked at it one last time. Its ash pattern reminded me of flames of what they tried to burn away. I whispered, "You didn't win." I slipped into the night. On my walk home, I didn't look through the rain-streaked windows of my old apartment. I focused on the sign swinging in the dark, bold letters lit by a single street lamp. It read, R.R.R. Callahan, consultant and advocate. I had built a place to belong, not for headlines or approvals, but because some stories don't need to shout, they just need a place to be told. And mine would never disappear again. If you've ever sat at a table where your name wasn't spoken, if you've opened a drawer and seen a family photo where your face was missing, if you've ever been erased not through words, but through silence, I want you to know you're not alone. My story isn't special in the sense of being rare. In fact, it's painfully common. Too many people return from something difficult, war, divorce, depression, or just growing up and discover their seat has quietly been taken away. There are people who are still here, still breathing, but in the eyes of their families, in the system's paperwork, or in group texts, they've vanished. And the hardest part, most don't even know where to start reclaiming themselves. The truth is, healing today often happens quietly, not on stages, not through memoirs, but in small support groups, in midnight text replies, in community legal clinics, in digital platforms like Second Shift, in people like Riley who hold the door open for others and simply say, "You matter." Sometimes healing doesn't look like justice in full. Sometimes it's just one person whispering, "I believe you," and that's enough to bring someone back. If you're still reading this and something in this story tugged at you, maybe you're on a journey too. Maybe you're trying to reclaim something that was always yours, your name, your voice, your place. I don't know your name, but I know you're trying, and that is enough. If you want to keep walking alongside stories like this, stories without superheroes, without miracles, just quiet, steady strength, I invite you to subscribe to this channel. Not to make me famous, but to make sure voices like Riley's don't disappear again. Thank you for staying. And if today you feel like you don't belong anywhere, please remember there are spaces being built quietly, but intentionally for you.